think now you can understand why it is that we said that we wanted to cut short the bios. We really want to hear all of the substantive stuff that we have to say and our speakers have to say. So the same is going to hold true for the second session that I'm very excited to be moderating. This is the 13th Amendment, New England's Slavery Ties and Why They Matter. And I am so pleased to be joined here on stage with my panelists. We have three scholars whose focus is on examining the historical record of slavery, the business of slavery, and the lives of enslaved people in New England. We have Professor Christy Clark-Pujara, who comes to us from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. We also have Dr. Kiara Singleton, who's the Executive Director of Royal House and Slave Quarters in Massachusetts. And we have Ms. Tracy Picard, who is a researcher and public historian at the Center for Reflective History in Providence. Very pleased to have them here on stage with me. It's interesting, when we decided that we would start thinking about New England's ties to slavery, there's a book called Dark Work that Professor Clark-Pujara has written, and it is all about the business of slavery in Rhode Island. Our first panel discussion, after having found these incredible people to join me, everybody said, oh yeah, we've all read Dark Work. So that is actually one of the organizing themes of the thinking of the panel, and also the way that we'll launch into our discussion. And I want to throw out two questions that I'm not even going to necessarily say that one particular person wants to answer this, because we really do want the opportunity for a conversation. So my first two questions that I want you all to jump in on, in whatever order you want, is why is it important to discuss the history of slavery in the North today? And what does it mean to commemorate emancipation in a region that profited from slavery? I am going to toss it out there and let one of you pick up the reins.
Well, I'm happy to start. First, I want to say thank you to everyone for being here, and thank you to Judge Long for the invite and all of the sponsors for making this possible. This is a real treat for me to come back to Rhode Island, a place where I have spent several summers in the archives. So why do we need to know the history of slavery in the North? Because if you don't know the history of slavery in the North, you don't know the history of slavery in British North America or the United States. It is an absolute myth that slavery was a Southern institution. It was a colonial institution and then a national institution. So it's a misunderstanding of the entire institution of slavery, socially, economically, and legally. If you don't understand the roots of slavery in the North, every northern colony legalized race-based slavery, created race-based slavery, and every legislative body in the North and every court in the North upheld and supported race-based slavery. So not understanding slavery in the North is a real problem, and it's a persistent myth. And really kind of my go-to facts are, we're sitting in Rhode Island. When did Rhode Island abolish slavery? 1842. When did New Jersey? The 13th Amendment, right? And so this misunderstanding about the practice of slavery in the North, and that includes the Midwest, where I'm from, in places like Wisconsin and Illinois and Michigan and Ohio, has really led many Americans, I think white Americans in particular, into thinking about slavery and racism as a northern issue, as a southern issue, rather than a national one. And I would be remiss not to mention the name of a mentor and a great scholar who lives right here in Rhode Island by the name of Joanne Pope Mellish, who wrote Disowning Slavery, which is a history of how New Englanders forgot their slaveholding past.
Would either of you care to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I think with the celebrations coming up of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, I'm based in Massachusetts, and one of the things that I find quite upsetting are all of the conversations that are about the great abolitionist history of Massachusetts. Massachusetts, loves to talk about the revolution, loves to talk about its revolutionary past, but it's through a 19th century understanding of the history. The 18th century, the 17th century is all about the history of slavery. And so I always like to say, okay, well, what were the abolitionists trying to abolish? It's not just the Frederick Douglasses that are coming to places like Faneuil Hall and the African Meeting House in the 19th century. There are also the everyday Black people who are petitioning against slavery in the 18th century. The earliest freedom suit that we see is 1701 by a man named Adam. He gets his freedom, and then by 1703, the first anti-slavery pamphlet in the area is created called The Selling of Joseph. And so when we actually start and understand this history through a 19th century understanding, we do two things. We create the myth that slavery was a Southern institution and that the North and places like Massachusetts were the cradle of liberty. And if we ask the cradle of liberty for whom, then it's going to be for white people, not Black people. And so I think a part about acknowledging the history of slavery in the North is also acknowledging the legal and social activism of Black people in the 18th century. All of that is foundational to the larger abolitionist movement that we have come to really associate with the 19th century telling of history.
Thank you. So actually, Ms. Picard, I'd like to turn to you and ask you to share with the audience, how do we know what we know? We've just heard some things from both Professor Clark-Pujara and Dr. Singleton about these stories that are uncovered that they're working on. How do we know? You're a public researcher and public historian. Why should we believe you?
Great question. And the first I would say, don't believe me 100%, right? Always question historians. Never just believe that because I'm sitting up here, I'm right. I would love to say that history happens like law through our arguments, through participation. So no, you shouldn't just believe that I saw it in an archive, so we're all good. But how do we know what we know is a great question. People don't always understand what is in an archive. And this is especially important, building on the last question, the difference between the North and South. Southern slavery is very image-based. Our understanding of the cotton plantation includes a lot of images. We have photos of slavery in the 1860s, and that affects us emotionally very strongly, almost a visceral, oh, this is a serious problem. We don't have images of enslaved people working in port cities like Providence or Boston in the 1700s, just because there was no photos. So what we have is documents, both from enslaved and formerly enslaved people and their descendants, and documents from enslavers. Often a lot of why we have these information is because someone was in trouble. It is through the legal system, through challenges, through probates, wills, runaway ads in the newspaper, obituaries, all of these records of conflict, of problems, of loss, give us little bits of knowledge that historians interpret and put together to form stories.
And stories. So go ahead.
Yeah, and whenever you have a history book, the first thing you need to check is, where are the footnotes? And how robust are those footnotes? Because historians, like scientists, tell you how they know what they know. I believe X, Y, and Z. Here are the documents that I read. This is where you can find those documents. So any history book that does not have a robust set of footnotes that tells you exactly where you can go and access those documents either online or in the archives is suspect. Historians should also explain how they know what they know. What was their methodology, right? Why do you talk with such fluency about what was going on in the colonial legislature in Rhode Island? And I'll give you an example. I spent an entire summer reading the colonial records of Rhode Island in their entirety because I needed to be able to talk about what was going on socially and what family was mad at another family for letting their sheep and goats graze in their yard, and who was suing who for breach of contract, and who was sitting on the legislative board that was deciding that, right? And so it's incredibly time-consuming, but also incredibly necessary, because if you're going to talk about a group of people, a place, you need to understand the social fabric of that place. So that means you got to be in people's diaries and in their letters to understand who they are as people. And then a good historian will tell you where to go and do that if you are interested in doing so. Rhode Island has, New England in general, y'all are obsessed with your history. And as a Midwesterner, I wasn't quite ready for that. I had never really been out of the Midwest. I'm from Nebraska. I went to school in Minnesota and Iowa. I'm now at Wisconsin. And I came here, and there was a historical society on every corner, right? And that's one of the reasons why I picked Rhode Island. It was small enough that I could get to them all, right? It was a practical thing in grad school. I was like, I can actually visit all of the archives there and immerse myself into who these people were. And Rhode Islanders were weird in the best way, but weird. But that's how you want to test it, right? I always tell my students that, how do they know what they know? Go to the footnotes, right? Because they should be able to direct you to the documents. And many of those documents are legal documents because, as my colleague Tracy said, that's where you get into the weeds.
And I can just sort of fact check that for a minute, because I was working on my remarks, my welcome remarks, and I came across the fact that Professor Clark Pujara has this one figure, 514 slave ships, but yet this other historian says 934, and so I emailed her at 11:30 at night. She emailed me right back, check slavevoyages.com.
Which, if you're interested, slavevoyages.com, it started off as a CD-ROM. I'm aging myself. When I was in grad school, and now it's an online source. But it has the records of the transatlantic slave trade. So it was a business. So we have the insurance records, we have ship manifests, we have investment reports. There's over 36 documents in the transatlantic slave trade database. This was put together by historians in the 1990s who said, we're only seeing our small part, right? What if we had a central database, right? And now it's an open source on the internet. It also changes because as new documents are found, that is added to the database. And that information was turned over to statisticians, which is why I can say 19,500, right? Where do those numbers come from? It comes from a real place. The insurance records are the best because, like when you buy a house and get insurance and they want to know everything about that house and car, they want to know everything about that slave ship. How many people were on it? How many sailors did you have? How much food did you have? How many barrels? Sometimes they count the number of nails that were used to build a ship. And so you know granular detail about these voyages, and the investment reports tell us how many people survived and what they were sold for. And so we know a lot about the transatlantic slave trade because it was a business, and we have the business records.
So I want to, we're talking about these big, important themes, and it's great to confront them. But I think sometimes there's a tendency when we have big information, we don't really maybe absorb it in the way that we do when we start thinking about individual lives, people. And the business that we are in law, is about people's stories. And it's about people with problems coming to our courts or to lawyers who are transactional lawyers, insurance lawyers, having a problem that needs fixing. Can we turn to the lives of enslaved and unfree people in the 1700s and early 1800s here in New England and think about the distinctions between the North and the South as we do that?
I think it's a really great question, and we can. I think so often, even when we're talking about business records, we will assume that there's nothing that we can learn about the individual lives of enslaved people because these records are dictated through people who are in power. So they're controlling and constructing how the story are told. But actually, one of I think the most powerful things that we have petitions. I run a historic site, the Royal House and Slave Quarters. There's a woman there, Belinda Sutton, and she has one of the earliest and successful, what we would call today a reparation petition. And in those petitions, there are a series of them. Most historians have only talked about the first petition, and they say, you know, she won. The legislature awarded her a sum of 15 pounds and 12 shillings after she petitioned the court to say she deserved reparations for being enslaved for 50 years by Isaac Royal. So that is a huge win in the 18th century, right? The fact that we even have these documents are amazing. But one of the things that happens with that is that when you only focus on that particular success, you actually end up kind of erasing her life in many ways. So she has become a symbol for this successful reparations case in the 18th century, and then most people don't know anything about her life. But if you read all of the petitions, you find out a few things. You find out she gets married at one point, so her last name is Sutton. You find out she'd been living in Boston. You find out that she does not get all of the money, so she is constantly petitioning. And I like to say at some point she realized that she wasn't going to get all of that money. But she keeps petitioning like we've come to associate with Black women in the 19th century to kind of leave a record behind of her life. And through those records, she talks about the fact that she is starving, that she needs this money to not only support herself, but to support her child who is infirm. And so when we do that, then we get to have a different conversation about what freedom looks like after slavery, right? So here's this woman, she is free, but freedom does not just, come with the end of systemic racism. In fact, people are struggling to find places to live. They're struggling to find good jobs so that they can support themselves, so that they can feed themselves. And then if you go to another institution, which is my favorite institution to study, the poorhouse, what you see is that a lot of times we're told that we can never reconstruct the lives of poor Black people in that early period. But actually, if you go and look at those records, they are all throughout there. You see them come in, you see them come out. You get to have an understanding of what is happening with them economically. But these state records also take biographies. So then it actually tells you their entire lineage. So as they are sitting to enter the workhouse, people are writing down these small micro-histories of them. You start to know about their family members, what street they lived on, and then if you keep looking at those records, you find out how long they've been in there, you find out when they die in there, and then you find out when they're buried and where they're buried. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing with a few researchers in Boston is actually trying to reconstruct these lives that we think just don't exist. And so sometimes these records, these state records, these business records are an entryway into building out the lives and the worlds of Black people. And we have so often just assumed that Black people's worlds are mostly structured by white people, but they're actually not, even in the 18th century.
Ms. Picard, I'm going to ask you, you're with the Center for Reflective History, and some of the work that you're doing in Providence is also, it seems like you're on this same path. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm so excited to be with other people who are interested in these little details because they can tell you a lot. And I'll tell you one of my favorite collections as I'm going through and learning about people in this time. And I love people. People are the most important thing. People are everything, right? We're nothing without the people in history. And there's a collection called the Writs and Warrants in the Providence City Archives. Maybe some of you have heard of this. It comes from probate court. And this includes a large amount of people who had been enslaved and were now free, their children, and generally lower income, lots of women, lots of widows, Black, white, indigenous, from Providence. And what it really shows, people are taking each other to court for as low as 50 cents up to maybe $100, small claims. This was before inflation, so 50 cents was more meaningful. And when you bring these small claims to the judge, you're bringing evidence, and that evidence is a receipt. Now, they don't all have a receipt, but many do. They show a few things: the literacy or lack of the person buying or selling, and the relationships. So you can see in these writs and warrants, boarding house keeper charging a black sailor for room and board, for laundry. You can see what they were eating, medical care, clothing. And in addition to all of the records, of course, we don't have that clothing, but understanding what people were surrounded by, what was important to them, does help us recreate their daily life. So if someone were to go through your house and look and see what you valued and what you throw away and what was important to you, they understand something about you and your life. So going into these, say, 1805 grocery list of what the person bought and couldn't pay for, you actually understand what their day-to-day life included. Maybe you would say, wow, they bought 30 tongues, they must have a lot of people to feed, right? Oh, you see this woman was doing a lot of laundry, or someone else, a burial, so you see they had a loss of a family member. So I totally agree that by going into these records, you can recreate meaning and relationship between people, something that can easily be overlooked when we only look at dates and names of the most important people in a town or in a history.
So Professor Clark-Pujara, I know you have lots of stories about lots of different folks, and I'd love to hear about any or all of them that you think you can talk about.
I'll try to be succinct here because my colleagues have done such a great job of talking about the details of everyday life and how important that is to actually understanding who people were. I want to address the second part of your question, like what's the difference between Northern and Southern slavery? The first is scale, right? Most people, when I ask them to close their eyes and imagine American slavery, they imagine a cotton plantation. Cotton is the last iteration of the plantation economy in North America. The first is tobacco, the merchant industry, rice, right? Cotton is post the American Revolution. It's not grown commercially until then. Slavery as an institution thrives through the tobacco plantations and the rice plantations, right? Tobacco colonists learn from indigenous people and go, this is going to be a big deal in Western Europe, and it was. Rice was braided into the hair of enslaved women who didn't know where they were going, and so they wanted to make sure they could feed themselves, and it becomes the economy of the Carolinas. It introduces rice to the diet of Western Europeans and all of us today. I mean, I would be willing to bet that most people in this room have rice in their house. How does that happen? That's a West African staple that has just become a staple in our lives as well. So cotton is the last iteration, but there's so much focus on it because it was the cotton industry that makes America a 19th century economic behemoth, right? But before that, we have tobacco, we have rice, but we also have what I think is the least understood aspect of the economy of slavery, and that is the merchant trade and skilled trades and everyday labor. What made enslaved people so incredibly valuable was the fact that they were people. So they could do anything. So a Rhode Island governor can decide that the enslaved boy that he is holding in bondage is going to be his secretary and accountant and bookkeeper and raise him and educate him to be so. Now, some people may be looking at me going, well, wasn't it illegal to teach enslaved people to read? That is an antebellum law from Alabama. That was not, there was no like centralized federal law. There were literate enslaved people. because what made enslaved people valuable was their fact that they were people. They could be a shopkeeper, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a shipbuilder. Like, they're not confined to manual labor. And they served as, secretaries for Rhode Island colonial governors as well, right? And left us incredible things like what they took on a picnic with their friends who met and then married later on. So they're trying to build free lives within the strictures of slavery. This was a highly mobile group of people in the North because they were tasked to run errands, especially in urban environments. Because again, we're so conditioned about thinking about slavery in rural areas that we forget that it thrived in urban areas. And when you look at the demographics of slavery, in the North, they're highly concentrated in cities and counties. So no more than 5% of the population, and this is true in both the colonial period and the post-colonial period in the North, were enslaved. But they were highly concentrated in specific places, like New York City, where at one point, 25% of the population lived in bondage. That's like every fourth person you saw, right? So highly concentrated in places like Newport and Providence and Charlestown and Boston, right? Rhode Island had the highest population of enslaved people by 1750, if you're thinking about percentage-wise. 10% of the population in the colony, but 25% in the cities and in South County, right? So highly concentrated. And these people are doing all kinds of things. Think if you're a blacksmith and you save up enough to buy a person. You buy someone who becomes a skilled blacksmith and never becomes your competition like an apprentice. Mm-hmm. So you see high slave ownership among the skilled trades, right? And this is true of the Narragansett farmers. There were about 20 families that were running farms in the Narragansett, and they were growing stuff like carrots and potatoes. They were raising cows and pigs. They were also they were fishing cod and salting it. And New England farmers were doing this all over New England. Nobody in Western Europe wanted their cheese, butter, onions, carrots, potatoes, beef, and pork. They had all of that. But there was a huge market for it in the Caribbean, which they called the West Indies, right? Because that's where the main plantation crop was being grown that has shaped all of our lives, sugar. And it was called white gold. And sugar was so desired, right? Because you have sugar, you want it forever. We all battle to not have sugar, right? You don't have to sell sugar. You've never seen a commercial for sugar. We're programmed for it, right? So there's this insatiable, it's funny, but it's true. There's an insatiable desire for sugar. And sugar was called white gold. And it made more sense to cut down basically all of the trees in the Caribbean. It's reforested a little bit now. And import your food for the slave populations that are growing it. If you look at where most of the West and Central Africans that were trafficked from Africa end up, they don't end up in North America. North America receives less than 5%. Most go to South America and the Caribbean, right? Because they are growing sugar. And in the Caribbean, in South America, it's gold and coffee. But it's in the Caribbean, it's sugar, right? So you import all of your food, right? Because you make more money using that land to grow sugar. So I grew up learning about hardy Puritans and New England farmers who were very hardworking and they had these small family farms. What I didn't grow up hearing was that they were selling it to feed the slave populations of the Caribbean. Right, that there's this bilateral trade between New England and the Caribbean. What do New Englanders get in return for their foodstuffs? They get molasses. And what do they do with that molasses? They distill it into rum, which is the #1 export throughout New England, which is in huge demand throughout Western Europe. And then and now, liquor is recession-proof, right? There's always a market for spirits. Right? And rum is delicious, right? It really invents the cocktail, something that we've all had. And New Englanders remain committed to the business of slavery. I'm willing to bet that everybody in this room has a pair of jeans Levi Strauss bought their patent from a Negro cloth mill in Rhode Island. Negro cloth was this material that was specifically made for the lives of enslaved people. And that gets us back to the question that Judge Long asked. We know what kind of clothes they wore. We know what they did in the little bit of free time they had. They did things like build community, right? So this enslaved man who is working, and I have to look at my notes because I'm in the middle of writing another book, and so I have forgotten the names of people in the first book that I wrote, and so I have to go back and, oh, this is good.
Caesar?
Yes, this is Caesar, Caesar London. So Caesar London is the enslaved secretary for Rhode Island Governor Uzziah, right? And so he is in a particular position in which his enslaver doesn't just use the stick, he also uses the carrot, right? He wants to keep Caesar happy. And so Caesar has an opportunity to do things like take his friends for a picnic in the country. And he lists the contents. They had tea and biscuits and some fruit, and he lists the names of the people that were with him, and there's nothing frivolous about this. As people, if we do not socialize and love on each other, we cannot make it. How do enslaved people emotionally and mentally survive bondage? Because people cared about each other. And I'm gonna make sure that your favorite biscuits are gonna be at this picnic we go to. Two couples later on get informally married who were on that picnic. This is of substance. This is the thing of life. And we have record of that. Enslavers wrote about enslaved people all the time. They complained about them all the time. And their complaints led to legislation about them, and then they show up in the court records. So this idea that we cannot know their lives simply just does not hold water. Now, if you're lazy and want to go to the archive and only read the easy stuff, that holds true. But if you are willing to spend the time, and if you have institutional backing like I had in graduate school at the University of Iowa, and I have now at the University of Wisconsin, to take several summers and read against the grain and read things all day and not get anything, but then the next day be full of things, right? It is absolutely possible to know about their everyday lives and how they lived and the fact that they dreamed and hoped. And I think it's essential because when we think about enslaved people as folks that are just acted upon, that didn't shape the societies in which they live, we contribute to their dehumanization.
Wow. Okay. So there's so much in there. Mindful of our time, and I know that we may take questions, but there's still so many questions that we have, and I want to pick up on this theme of the Negro cloth jeans, Levi Strauss jeans, something that from not only slave time, but also the Negro cloth that was from the industrial North that we still have today. And I also think about some of these things that we know we have from the past that carry forward from Belinda. I think the petition that you referenced earlier has inspired some art even. Is that fair to say? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think, so there are a few things. I'm actually happy that you brought up art because, you know, one of the things that I think frustrate me about when we're talking about the history of slavery, and like today when people are, you know, so against Black history and slavery history, and, you know, you have people getting up on national television and making it seem as though slavery was just some type of unpaid internship in which Black people gained skills. And so then the skills that they gained, you know, made slavery okay. And it's like, that is ridiculous. One of the things that is essential to me is that if anyone comes to the Royal House and slave quarters, particularly students and Black students, is that they leave understanding that slavery, I asked them, what is slavery about? Almost everyone says race. And then I smile. And I go, is it about anything else? And they're like, no. And I'm like, labor. you know, and really having them think about the fact that, you know, Black people have all types of skills, and this is partially why they are being taken, right? And those skills go into the literal building of this country. And so when we think about that, sometimes we also lose the fact that the things that they make have survived, and oftentimes we don't even attribute it to them. And so I've been working on a project around Black enslaved potters. We talk about the Black enslaved potters from the South. There was an amazing exhibit that was traveling from the MFA, and I think also the Met in New York, and then I think it went to Michigan, and then also Atlanta, about Dave the Potter. And when I came in to talk with the team about the exhibit, they're like, yeah, we're gonna talk about slavery, you know, in the South. And I said, well, they're enslaved potters. They're enslaved potters in Boston and Charlestown, in fact. And they're like, wait, what? And I'm like, yes. And in particular, there are two men, Jack and Acton, and we know that they were enslaved by the Parker Pottery House, one of the largest potteries in the 18th century. That pottery made its way all the way down to South Carolina, and then as far north as Canada. And if you go into museums, you'll see these beautiful pieces of pottery. And these are everyday wares. You can think about the fact that they're in homes. People are using them to drink out of, to eat out of. They are circulating all over the place. And then we just associate them with, you know, white artisans. And there's never a thought about whose hands could have crafted those pieces. And they're on display because they are beautiful. They're works of art. They tell us about everyday life in the past. Now, when we reframe that a little bit and we just look at some of these records and you see who these potteries enslaved, well, you just start seeing Black people everywhere. And then you start to ask, well, what were they doing? Well, of course they were potters. Of course they're makers. Of course they're doing all of this work. So one of the things that we've been doing is we paired with an artist, Stephen Hamilton. He is actually a graduate student in the AAAS department at Harvard, but he is a weaver. And he learned how to weave in Nigeria, and we teach students how to weave, how to sew. They do tie and dye, and then and they do this all on a plantation that's, if you've not been to the Royal House and Slave Quarters, it's in the middle of a residential neighborhood. So everything that you look around and see, it was once part of the plantation. But today, they're all houses that surround it. And they do this work, and then they learn about the history of Black cultural production. And one of the reasons why we do this is, one, if you were to try to take a weaving class today, it is very expensive. Thousands and thousands of dollars. These are traditions that are coming from the continent. And so we make it free. And we make it free so that students can learn how to do it. And then we can, not only, my goal is to get them to talk about slavery, right? But they don't always want to talk about slavery. They want to make fun stuff. I'm like, great, come on this plantation and make fun stuff. And then you get to learn about the history of slavery. And then you get to understand that when we're talking about these beautiful pieces of art, well, who was making all of the clothes on the plantation? Who's making the blankets? Who's making the pillowcases? Well, these are the weavers and the sewers. They had those skills already. And in fact, they're teaching white women on the plantation how to do it as well. And so when you reframe it that way, it is so powerful. And then when we think about art, when we think about African textiles, when we think about these traditions, then we can install a sense of pride and kind of start to overcome the shame that is associated with slavery, and the sense that slavery was a horrible institution, is a violent institution. And yet I think it is extremely important for students to come in and learn not only about the violence of slavery, but also to learn about all of the amazing culture that Black people brought with them from West Africa, and that continues today. And so I think art is one of the ways that we get to do it. And all of the students, we work with about 12 students over the course of 7 weeks. You never let historians plan a summer program because everything is important. So when we first started asking parents about their children coming, they said, how many days? I said, 3 days a week, 6 hours a day. They said, oh my gosh, please sign them up. And we were like, oh, we got so many more students than we thought. And then we realized, oh, this is a lot of work. But the beauty of that is that everything that they made, they were able to display it at one of the art galleries at Harvard where Carrie Mae Weems displayed work. And they didn't think, at the beginning when they started it, they were like, whatever, y'all, I don't know what y'all are doing. And then at the end, when their parents came, they were snapping photos and taking videos, and they were really proud of what they made. And I think that is also the power of history. It's not also in what we produce as scholars, but what we can also create with community.
Wonderful. So, Ms. Picard, I want to pivot on this a little bit too for you, because students are not always little people, right? Or medium-sized people. Sometimes they're big people. And in fact, our justice writers, some of our justice writers, have taken a tour with you at Brown University. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how this through line of from the past to today, maybe through tours or other things that you care to comment on?
Oh, gosh. It's hard to, this was so beautiful, it's hard to follow. So I think it's important to say that growing up, I hated history. I just thought I didn't see myself in it, and I didn't see anyone I knew in it. And how do we communicate history? So by talking about stories and people is important. Talking about making and engaging with making is so important. But also getting people out, moving around, and noticing things. And I love doing the walk through Brown because it reminds me of the many times I walked by and didn't notice. I didn't notice how much labor it took to build University Hall. I didn't notice the plaques that were put up. I just walked by. But as soon as you see something, you can't really unsee it. As soon as you engage with people, with the public, you can't unengage. It just kind of becomes part of you, and now, what else? What else is out there? What else can I learn? And I love working with the tour because you don't know who's going to show up. It could be someone that knows way more than me, or a group of high school students who pretend to fall asleep. And have the thrill of being that person who bridges, who spends time in that archives, who gets deeply into those stories that we don't all have the time to do or even access. And bringing that to whoever comes along and figuring out in the moment how to get them to care, how to get them to notice. It's a very beautiful process. It's an honor to be able to mediate that history. And I really think part of the problem with history is just reading books or sitting in a classroom alone isn't enough. History is everywhere, and we can't just put history into history class. History has to be alive for us in our environment. You know, how often do we just talk to non-historians, talk to each other about history while riding the bus or in the line at the grocery store? It's part of everything. It's so important. It's context, it's foundation. So walks and making and stories are all different methods to bring that out and help us all engage, notice, care about history.
I love that. So I know we are actually going to have some art in about 10 minutes, so I want to use this 10 minutes wisely. One of the things that Professor Eiffel mentioned was the Underground Railroad, and I think this is fascinating in terms of stories and noticing and what we think of. And in our discussions, we talked a little bit about what we in the North think about with respect to the Underground Railroad and what we may not actually think about vis-a-vis emancipation and gradual emancipation here in New England. The stories that we tell ourselves, I think, or that we default to are the stories, I think, a little bit of look at all these people who helped with the Underground Railroad, not, we passed gradual emancipation statutes to get as much labor out of people as we could. In our limited time, I'm wondering if we can look a little bit into, talk a little bit about this Underground Railroad, gradual emancipation, kind of these hypocrisies.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I just do want to piggyback, and I'm cognizant of the time, off of like talking about creativity and ingenuity. Something that I always start all of my classes with is music, because we are ingesting a culture that was created by the ingenuity, creativity, and genius of enslaved people in this country every day. I am willing to bet that everybody in this room in the last 24 hours listened to a song that had a call and a response, that had a hook, that was invented by enslaved people in North America. And now we just understand it to be common, popular music. Almost everyone in this room knows someone whose favorite food is mac and cheese. Again, enslaved people, anything with sweet potatoes. Cooking slow over a fire for long periods of time to make tough meat taste good. Again, the cooking traditions. We literally ingest the culture of slavery on a regular basis. We listen to the culture of slavery on a regular basis, and we don't attribute that to that. So I always just like to remind my students of that, and I bring them stuff like sweet potato pie and that kind of thing. Like we taste it. As far as gradual emancipation, like everyone knows how slavery ended in the South, right? There's war, right? There's laws, and then there's the 13th Amendment. In the North, it was just a lot messier than that. You start to see the decline of slavery in the North after the American Revolution, and what sparks it are the actions of enslaved people, right? So we're in Rhode Island, so I'll talk about the Rhode Island First. The Rhode Island First was a nearly all-black regiment that fought in the American Revolution. Most of them had been formerly enslaved, and in exchange for their service, they were granted their freedom and given a small fee, a small payment, and many of them used those payments to purchase people and their families, right? And so enslaved people themselves tore at the institution of slavery in the North. And because the business of slavery was more important in the North than the labor of enslaved people, there was just enough political and social room to do that. But it happened really slowly, and it happened unevenly. So when students ask me, well, when did slavery end in the North? I say, you got to be more specific. What state are you talking about, right? Are you talking about New Hampshire? Because then we're talking, 1780. Are you talking about Rhode Island? Then it's 1842. Are we talking about New York? It's 1827. New Jersey, 1865. Like, it is across the board. But gradual emancipation laws were actually the reflection of enslaved people tearing at the institution of slavery and making bargains with their enslavers to buy themselves. And when you read the laws, they all read remarkably similar, and I'll recite the one I know the best from Rhode Island. Children born after March 1st of 1784 will be indentured to their mother's masters, but not enslaved for life. Until when they reach their majority. But what's your majority? That's in the 20s, in the 1780s, right? So it doesn't free a single person born before March 1st, 1784, which means enslavers lied about when people were born, right? Because they wanted to keep them in perpetual race-based hereditary bondage. So you got these suits of when were people born, and then what if a woman had a child while she was still indentured to her mother's master? Well, what's that child? Well, then now that child has to be right, which allows enslavers to manipulate families, to steal labor for generations, right? Because most women are having children in their late teens in this period before their majority, right? And so you have a community of Black people who start to come together to try to communally buy each other, and you have families where some people are free and some people are indentured and other people are enslaved, right? And so the North is this hodgepodge, and it takes generations to remove themselves from bondage. They get charged over market rate, and so it's a very messy and complex story that most people never get exposed to, right? And so When does slavery end in the North? Technically, 1865.
Amazing. Okay, so we are down to our last few minutes, and I don't know if anybody has a burning question, because I do want to make sure that we leave enough time then for our art exhibit that is meant to be at noon, correct, Judge DeVos? So if no one has a burning question, I have more, but I wanna open it up to, I know that young woman, Miss Haley Long.
Oh, that is hilarious.
So, one of you mentioned spending the entire summer in the Rhode Island colonial records. And I'm curious about how people who aren't trained in history can still meaningfully engage with archives and historical material. Like you said, always go to the footnotes. People who don't have the same level of training as someone who works professionally as a historian, how can they find ways to engage?
Go ahead. I think it's a really good question, and I think one of the places where we should start is that actually people have always been the own stewards and keepers of their history. When I was doing some dissertation work in Baltimore, I would go to the Baltimore City Archives, and every day there were a group of about 6 older Black women who were helping to organize those records because they didn't have the conditions to protect those records, so many of them were kind of disintegrating. And so this group of women were in there. They were in there and they were going through them. They were helping them digitize it. And they helped me a lot, actually. They were like, have you seen this? Have you seen this? Have you seen that? And so in many ways, I think actually, especially with the rise of genealogy, and genealogy has always been something that I think has been really important for a lot of communities. People have been in the archives. I think the bigger issue is that we don't always listen to them. So I have an amazing colleague who wrote a report for the Shirley Eustace estate. His name is Abid Alibi. And one of the things that started happening when he was researching slavery and the Eustace estate was that the community members kept saying, I'm pretty sure there was a slave quarters over there. And they had been saying that for generations, and no one listened to him. But because he's a PhD student, then he said, hey, I think this building was a slave quarters. And they were like, we don't know. And he's like, I'll figure it out. And then he went and he did the research and he figured it out. And so I think sometimes we also have to really understand that people have a lot of knowledge that they can give us, and only if we listen. And part of our jobs is also to invite those people to the table who have also been doing this work, and make sure that they're part of those conversations. Because it's very easy for me to walk into a space and people say, oh, University of Michigan, PhD, all these things. Great, we just believe you. There's no question about it, actually. And yet they won't believe, the 75-year-old 5 doors down from that same place that's been saying it and screaming it from the rooftops. And so what I like to do is that I like to say that archives are actually really hard to access. And so one of the best things we can do is, if people are interested in it, just show people how to navigate them if they don't know how to navigate them, because technically they are free and accessible to the public, even though many of them don't feel as though they are free and accessible for the public. And then oftentimes, those people and those historical societies, when you go there, who are just, kind of local historians who are interested in the work, many of them have done so much incredible groundwork that has shaped how we are able to do our work. And I like to say historians have to stop acting like history isn't collaborative, right? Because it very much so is. And a lot of times, a lot of the work that we build upon are from these small papers that are written, at historic sites, and, are also, local histories that have a lot of gems in them, but don't have a big press behind them. And so I think a part of it is stepping back and letting other people shine, and also really taking seriously what they tell us.
Thank you so much. And so I have to just say, give a plug, that I did not plant my daughter in the audience. But I am so delighted that there are young people here who are hearing this message, because it's not just my daughter, but there are some students here from Bishop Hendricken High School. There are students here from Salve, Regina. There are young people here, and this message of listening. Listening is one that we know is really important in the courts and in law, and I love that the work that all of you are doing is also about listening and the collaboration, and I think that it's just fabulous. I would love it if everyone would give them a round of applause.